Welcome to Conversations with Writers. I'm Andy. I'm a writer and a writing instructor in higher education. And this is an educational YouTube series meant to catalog writing strategies and philosophies through conversation with other writers. Alison Jaenicke teaches writing at Penn State University, where she also serves as Assistant Director of Creative Writing and Faculty Advisor for the student literary journals Calliope and Clio. Her work has appeared in Pallades, Appalachian Review, Hippocampus, Superstition Review, Gargoyle Magazine, Storyscape Journal, Brainchild, and Literary Mama. Jaenicke's essay, I Slept Well If You Slept Well, published in Isthmus issue number 4, was recognized as notable in the Best American Essays 2016. And this is my conversation with Alison. Hi.
How you doing?
I'm okay. How are you?
Pretty good.
What are you working on now, and what motivated the project?
Well, I am a very slow, late bloomer writer person. I'm just like turtle, snail. So for a number of years, I'd say I have been tinkering with a project that I envision as a collection of essays about my grandmother and her 2 older sisters who lived in this small coal mining town in western Pennsylvania called Herminie. It's the town my mom and dad went to high school in, met in, left. It's the town where I was born and lived in my grandmother's house for the first year and a half of my life. And these 3 women, I feel like had a super profound effect on my life. And in my job here at Penn State as Assistant Director of Creative Writing, I get the opportunity to meet all these writers and sit in on class visits and go to readings. And often writers will say, write about the things that won't let you alone, write about your obsessions. And I would say these women, I've just been obsessed with my whole writing life, which has been quite a long time. And my Aunt Katie, who was the oldest of these 3 sisters, they all lived within a couple blocks of each other in this small town. They could walk to each other's houses. My Aunt Katie and my Aunt Margie never drove, so they walked or they took public transport. And my Aunt Katie is a really fascinating character, I think, because when she was a young mother, she lost her first husband in a coal mining accident. And she went on to serve as the postmaster of Herminie for 27 years. And for a woman to have her own job, her own livelihood, to have this position in the town really sort of affected, it was awful that she lost her husband, but she kind of ended up, it's interesting to look at these 3 sisters together and see their different trajectories. Anyway, I'm fascinated with their lives. I was very close with them. I have all kinds of letters that they wrote to me when I was little. They taught me things like from how to crochet to which side of the street to walk on when you're walking around the town. And so my Aunt Katie lived till age 103. She was tiny, tiny little woman. She bowled into her 90s. She was whip smart and very positive. She remarried another man later in life who had some money. And so she was sort of the wealthy aunt relatively to these Anyway, I could go on and on about these women, so you can see that I'm sort of obsessed with them, but that's what I've been working on writing. The 3 of them ended up living together in my grandmother's house in their old age, and my Aunt Margie lost her mind at the end. She never had any children. My mother was born in my Aunt Margie's house in her bed. My grandmother gave birth to her there. And so when my aunt was old and living in my grandmother's house, she would scream at my grandmother and say, "You stole my baby," which was a very sad. She just always felt so sad that she didn't have any children. Anyway, there's a lot I can say about them. I finally published the first of my essays about them earlier this year in Pallades. It's called Hair Receivers, and it's about the wigs that they wore and the hairdos and the wig that my Aunt Katie had made for me when I was in junior high, this fall that she matched to my hair. Anyway, so I finally published an essay there, and yeah, it's slow going, but I hope to finish this before I die. So I've been working on that, and I've also, in the middle of the pandemic this year, in January, I took up the writing challenge of our colleague, Heather Holloman, she's a published writer herself, and she has an Instagram where in January she was like, we're going to write a book this month. Okay, so let's get going. And here are some prompts. And I was like, okay, this might get me going on writing in the new year. And so she had some prompt about make a list of things that you know well that maybe other people don't know quite so well. And I thought, I'm kind of a dabbler. I don't play the guitar. I wish I did. I can't do this. I can't do that. And then I thought, well, actually, I'm kind of obsessed with and know the game of basketball pretty well. Like I grew up playing basketball in the District Heights Boys Club, which then became District Heights Boys and Girls Club in Prince George's County, Maryland, outside of DC. I went on to play in high school right around the time that Title IX was just getting going. I ended up coaching high school girls basketball when I taught high school in the DC area after grad school. And so I just started writing a little bit every day about that. So I thought by now I would have a little chapbook or like a little, I don't know, something. But so I'm working on that too. But as you know, when you're teaching, it's a little hard to, it's hard to get writing done. But that's what I've been working on this year and focused on.
Wonderful. And congratulations on your publication in Pallades.
Thanks.
So what have you learned about yourself through writing, and specifically writing about these women?
I guess, the older you get, and we're all getting older every day, and I feel like I'm getting super old, but I guess you start to see how you became, I have published fiction, nonfiction, poetry, but I really feel like I think of myself as a nonfiction writer, and that's what I enjoy writing the most. And so I think I've learned sort of what I'm made up of, and also seen the ways that my life is distinct from other people's lives. When you're growing up, when you're a kid, you sort of assume everybody's lives are roughly the same, but things start to come into sharp focus. The older you get, you see, well, that thread led to that, led to that, led to that. And that's why I'm like this. And so you just come to understand all kinds of things about yourself more. I'm still working on why do I love basketball so much? I just love it super deeply. Like if someone asks, what do you love in the world? I love nature, I love my family, but I really love the game of basketball. Did you know we have a colleague in the English department who played on the storied Pat Summitt basketball team at University of Tennessee in college? She went on scholarship, Debbie Hawhey. And so I'm going to go back to the basketball thing for a minute and just say that when I was working on this project this year, the basketball project, I was thinking about, I lived in Knoxville, Tennessee for 4 years, and we had season tickets to the women's basketball games there. And you may or may not know that Pat Summitt for a long time was the winningest coach in college basketball, men's or women's. The Women's Basketball Hall of Fame is in Knoxville, Tennessee, in large part because of Pat Summitt. And so this year I read Pat Summitt's last memoir called Sum It Up. And it was written with a Washington Post sports reporter, I think Sally Jenkins is her name. And because very tragically, Pat Summitt died of early onset Alzheimer's and had to step down from coaching. Anyway, so it's just interesting to read Pat Summitt's account of her life and coming up through different periods of time when women in sport was not really a thing that was valued. And so anyway, watching Pat Summitt talk about her own life in the context of the historical moment, that helps me sort of figure out my own life in the context of historical moments. And that's sort of one of my favorite kinds of writing to do, is to sort of recount my own memories that have stuck with me, but then also try to figure out, well, what was the historical moment that shaped my perception of that, or how I reacted in that moment, or how do the two worlds, personal and public and private, how do they collide? So that's sort of a roundabout answer, I think.
That was wonderful. Thank you. So what is the role or responsibility of writing for you? What keeps you generating material? Why write?
A writer can't always figure this out, why you're obsessed with the things you're obsessed with. And that's part of what I like about writing is it helps you figure out why that sticks with you and why it obsesses you. So why write? And this is a sort of sounds like a cliched answer that a lot of writers give. It's like, tried to give it up, but it won't give me up. Like it just obsesses you. You sort of have to write to figure these things out about your life. And so those projects that I mentioned earlier about writing about my grandmother and her two sisters, those two older sisters lived in 3 centuries. Well, at least my Aunt Katie did. She was born in the late 1800s and she lived into the early 2000s. So like the historical moments that she saw. But so why write? To witness to a particular historical moment. You are a person whose story, I've come to realize nobody's normal. Everybody's story is distinct. And I have finally realized that it is important for your story to get told, your individual story that no one else can tell. And so the basketball book and the essays about my grandmother and her sisters, those are stories that are asking me to go back in time and tell about long past things and to witness to those moments earlier in my life. But recently I've been thinking that I'm kind of chicken for not being a witness to the present moment and to the world as it is right now and who I am in this moment. So I've been trying to force myself to do what I think is important, a role or responsibility of a writer, and that is to witness to the current moment. So like this summer, one of my students was an intern for this Penn State project called Viral Imaginations. It's pulled together by professors from a number of different departments, and it's asking people in Pennsylvania or associated with Pennsylvania in some way, and you could submit something to Andy if you haven't already. Do you know about Viral Imaginations? No? Okay. Well, check it out. Viral Imaginations, they're trying to collect writing and art from Pennsylvanians, broadly defined, to witness to this pandemic moment. And so my student, Simon Hebert, who was in my nonfiction class last fall, asked if I would maybe think about writing something. So I did write a little essay and published it on that Viral Imaginations this summer. And then also one thing that really troubled me and a more recent event was the death of Osaze Osagi, a young Black man killed by police in State College a few years ago, which really ties in with the Black Lives Matters movement in State College. And from Osaze Osagi's death came this very active racial justice group in town now, the 320 Coalition. And so the week that Osaze Osagi was killed, which was in March 20, 320 Coalition refers to the date that Osaze was killed, March 20, 2019. So I went to a meeting down at Webster's, our local bookstore, to sort of just meet with other people who were just distraught and upset by this young man's death. And so just recently, just this summer, I published the essay that I've been working on for a few years about Osaze's death, about Black Lives Matters, about putting it in this historical moment. So anyway, I'm going to hold up shameless promotion, self-promotion. This is the Appalachian Review, which just came out in the last month, and in which my essay about Osaze's death and about all of these issues appears. It's called The Search for a Different Marvin Gardens, and it's for Osaze Osagi, August 2, 1989 to March 20, 2019. So that's something that motivated me to write, and I think it's my responsibility to witness to those moments. I knew early on in my writing impulse in college that I never wanted to be, I just really didn't want to be like a newspaper reporter where I would have to write really quickly about things and turn stories around super quickly. I'm more of a ruminator. And so to me, this essay that I began in 2019 and published in 2021, to me, that's quick. That's a quick turnaround on a writing project. I just want to give a little shout out to Montaigne, because, when I teach nonfiction writing here at Penn State, I want to underscore to to students that we're not writing the sort of Francis Bacon, very organized, here's a thesis and I'm just going to set out to prove it kind of writing. I mean, there's a place for that kind of writing in the world, right? But I subscribe in my own writing to the Montaigne sense of the essay, which is to try to figure out what you think through writing and to arrive at a truth by trying. And so the word essay, you may know, comes from the French word essayer, and which means to try or to attempt. And so I feel like writing is to try to understand myself and to understand others and the world that we live in and how all those things interact. And like I said, it's my responsibility, I think, to witness to the world that makes you and that you swim in, and that, you know, to tell the story that only you can tell.
I remember when the professor's son died here in State College, and I think because it was so close to home, it was, you know, part of our faculty, it kind of hit us all a little harder. And then we all started scrutinizing. And it's still something that our local communities have to deal with and suffer with daily. So it's important to write about.
Right. I mean, it's always Iyun Usagi was a colleague of ours in the English department. She left for Oregon a few years ago, but before she left, her office was right across the hall from mine. And so, yes, and I have a son who's in his 20s, and it's always a question, and this is something I talk about a lot in my writing classes, is as a white woman, is it my job to witness to the death of a young Black man in our community? And I think the answer is yes, but I'm very attuned to those sort of questions in writing too. Whose story is it? Who should tell this story? Whose lens should we hear this story through? When I was visiting my daughter, who just graduated from college in St. Paul, Minnesota this May, we went to George Floyd Square, and she said to me, "Mom, leave your camera in the car," because I do like to take pictures. And what I heard her saying in that, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but the way I interpreted it was, you can come here and pay respects and be reverent in this space, but we're going to let people in the Black community be the ones to sort of tell this story. And that's always a tricky thing that I wrestle with in my writing.
So when you're struggling to write for whatever reason, too many ideas, not enough time, what sort of strategies do you use to get yourself to the page? And what sort of challenges do these activities help you overcome?
I'm very sort of stop and go, trying to trick myself, never really finding the time. But a few things that have worked for me. Being in an academic job means that in the summertime, I have more time to focus on writing. So throughout the year, I try to write in a journal and catch little seeds of ideas as they come to me and write about them a little bit in my journal. And then sort of develop and work on those ideas more in the summer. I try to look at this calendar and map out a schedule time to write. I'm not very successful at that. I'm more successful when I've never gone to go to a residency and I'm going to stay here for a month and I'm going to write a book. I probably should do something like that, but I'm really torn between being in the world and I want to go hang out with friends, or I would miss, Arts Fest, or I don't know. I just have a lot of FOMO about the world. And so I've never done a residency, but one thing I have done 4 or 5 times now, starting in the mid-aughts, was I took myself to Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is at the tip of Cape Cod, and it's got a long history. In fact, the Fine Arts Work Center was started in part by Stanley Kunitz, poet who lived in Provincetown for a long time until he died. And there's just a long history of writers and artists on Cape Cod. And my brother-in-law and sister-in-law had a house in Truro at the time. And I thought, I could go. There are residencies at the Fine Arts Work Center that you can win by applying to go there and like work on your book and for a bunch of months. Like, for instance, Ann Patchett wrote her first novel at the Fine Arts Work Center. And so a lot of people have gotten their writing in there and found inspiration there. And So I went to a fiction writing workshop there. I can't remember what year, 2006, something like that, with Pam Houston. And this is you pay to go and be in a small workshop for a week with 10 or 12 other writers, and so it's a week of intense workshop, but you get to go to the beach too. So so I've done that a bunch of times, and I find that really gets me charged up. It forces me to make a manuscript that I'm going to share with people there before I go. Just forces me to read stuff. In the evenings, there are readings by the writers that are there teaching for the week. And so that's just also very inspirational. My most recent, so I've done a fiction writing workshop there with Pam Houston. I did a poetry and drawing workshop there with Elizabeth Bradfield and Mark Adams. I did a memoir workshop with Joan Wickersham, she was most excellent. I learned a lot about teaching from her. And I also learned about writing, obviously, and I really learned a lot by reading her memoir, The Suicide Index, about the death of her father by suicide. And then the most recent workshop I went to was the summer before the pandemic hit, summer of 2019, 4th of July week in Provincetown, which is a wild week in Provincetown. And I was there with Paul Lisicky, nonfiction writer. And that was a great week too. So that's been a really good method for me to sort of recharge. I've just encountered, like I said, I've encountered and discovered lots of great writers there. The last time I was there with Paul Lisicky, it caused me to not only read two of Paul Lisicky's books, which were great, but also it was nonfiction week when I was there. So there were all these really great nonfiction writers that I was exposed to, like Tessa Fontaine wrote a book called The Electric Woman, a memoir in 5 death-defying acts or something. That's an excellent book, and she was an excellent performer. She joined the last traveling sideshow, and this book came out a few years ago. So I've taught chapters from that book a bunch of times. And then Hanif Abdurraqib, who writes a lot about music, and his most recent book, which I can't wait to read, called Little Devil in America, just was on the list of National Book Award finalists for nonfiction. So hearing him read an essay about Don Cornelius, host of Soul Train, which I grew up with and loved watching when I was a kid, that was electrifying. What else do I do to get myself to the page? Oh, like I mentioned, I've been kind of a on and off journaler through the years, and I always like writing on the page, and I have stacks of really jaggedy, different sized journals. But a friend of mine was using this online program called 750 Words, which is free for the first month and $5 after that. It's an online journaling program, which you would think, well, can't you just use Word or something? But there's some features to it that make it super cool and better than Word. You can do this metadata thing where, let's say you want to track what you're thinking about your garden or whatever, you can track things. Or sometimes, so it's based on the morning pages from Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way, which I've used before to sort of jumpstart my creative juices. But just the idea that you write 3 pages in the morning, every morning, if you can. And that helps you just kind of clear your brain, sort of comb your brain's hair, get ideas going, generated. So when I was working on that basketball book in January, February, March, I would write some stuff like stupid things that nobody wants to read about what we did yesterday and what I'm worried about. And then I would just start a metadata tag that said like b-ball book. And then I just start writing parts of the book. And so because you're writing it and it's in a space where this isn't like a finished product or whatever, it feels like, oh, I can write whatever and I can just never return to it, or maybe I'll get to some kind of gem. So I'm sort of tricking myself. I think one thing that's really hard about writing these days is if I don't like to write in the document that's going to end up being the final document, because it just feels like you're committing things to the page. It feels paralyzing a bit to me. So I still like to draft in handwriting, or the 750 Words has been really helpful. I think I've written like 1 million words now over the past 2.5 years. So I don't know. Don't quote me on that. I could be wrong on the number.
That's amazing. Thank you. What part of the writing process do you enjoy the most and why?
Of course, just getting the idea down on the page and in a blaze of it's like, oh, this is great. This is like fiery and wonderful. And so that's always great. And then the reality of it, that's not an easy part when you have to actually shape it into something. And it's like, oh, it's not like Annie Lamott says in her book, Bird by Bird, you're going to have shitty first drafts. I mean, and so then you realize, oh, well, this is a shitty first draft and there's a lot of work I have to do. That's not my favorite part. The middle part is not my favorite part. Of course, my favorite part is the beginning fiery part. And of course, then you seeing it in print, which means you can't work on it anymore. It's done, because if it's not published, you could always keep working on it. I do enjoy the middle, like the little puzzly part of messing around with words and organizing and editing. I enjoy that sometimes, and reading it aloud to sort of hear where things work and don't work, if you have enough time. Yeah, so beginning and ending, of course, are the best, but I've come to love the middle part too.
What revision strategies do you find most useful for your own work? And what sort of challenges do those help you solve?
When I was teaching tech writing here, I learned this phrase, digital native and digital immigrant. And so digital native being people who came into this world and word processing existed and email existed and all the digital stuff that we use on a daily basis existed. I mean, when I was in college, I had a typewriter and I white out. So anyway, this is my long way of saying that I still like, in terms of revising, I kind of have to print everything out. Like when I get all my material, all my shards of the mosaic in an electronic document, I still need to print it out. And then I like using a pencil, with a mechanical pencil with an eraser. And I've gotten better about crossing stuff out and ditching things. And so one thing I teach my students is, and this was a hard lesson for me to learn myself, is that the first stage of revising is figuring out what no longer belongs and what do you have to clear away in order for the essence of the piece to shine. And so cutting is an important revision strategy. I don't do this thing about actually physically cutting the paper apart, but could be a good strategy if I tried it, but I haven't. But basically, I have to print stuff out on one side of the paper, and then I still cross stuff out and then flip the paper over and draft a new paragraph, and then arrows and numbers, like, oh no, this has to be at the beginning of the essay, number 1. Oh, this now is going to be 2. And then when it gets almost so messy that I can't follow it anymore, then I'll go back in and do it in electronic form and then just start that again. It's like washing and rewashing. And then of course, reading things when you get closer, well, even throughout the whole process, reading stuff aloud to hear the poetry and music of the language, and where it falls flat and where it just gets super boring, and where it's like, oh, okay, that was an unintended poetic device. We'll keep that. It's the only wisdom is that it's super messy and you just have to live with the mess. I read something one time, maybe it was in The Artist's Way, about good artists. You have to be ready to like leave your paints out and have things be in process and messy, and you're not going to be able to clean everything up at the end of the day. You have to accept that that's part of the process. That's why I sort of like and don't like that middle part of the of the writing, is that it's really messy, and it also feels like, is this ever going to not be messy? Am I ever going to get to a point where it's ready to present to the world? But the older I get and the more I've seen the process work, I feel like I can trust the process. There's a great quote from Julia Cameron in that Artist's Way book where she says, "Leap and the net will appear." And that quote has served me well many a time.
And I think that's very true about the writing process. It is quite messy, and if you're going to be a writer, you kind of have to learn to live with that messiness. What reading suggestions do you have? So I know that you've already mentioned quite a number of authors that you're reading, that you have read, but who do you keep in your back pocket? Who do you return to?
I read novels and fiction a lot, but let me just say that when I was in college, I never imagined I would publish my writing, but this little teeny like fire burning in me that said, you got to write really came from reading Joan Didion. And this was in the early 80s, and she was actively writing all kinds of stuff at the time, novels, but mainly nonfiction, some sort of in-depth journalism. I have a book of hers called Salvador. But anyway, her essays really made me think, that's the kind of writing I want to do. But at the time, that's not the kind of, even though Joan Didion was successful, it's not the kind of writing that was prized in writing programs, at least in the very conservative University of Virginia, male, Southern place I was. It was when I thought about like applying to MFA programs or doing writing, it was like, well, you've got to write fiction or you could do poetry. So I tried to write fiction, and not until really kind of recently in the last decade or so did when creative nonfiction and memoir really came into its own, did I realize, oh, that's a thing I can do. I can do that. So anyway, more recently, I've read more nonfiction writers. And I mean, so Joan Didion, somebody I return to again and again, Annie Dillard, Teaching a Stone to Talk, Tinker at Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. I've taught those books and essays from those books a number of times. And I love going back to them. So I don't know, I read a lot of different kind of stuff, but in terms of like nonfiction, and just like this year, for instance, I mentioned that I read Pat Summitt's memoir, but this summer, my husband and I were reading this memoir called Blood, Bones, and Butter. It came out a number of years ago, maybe a decade ago or eight or 10 years ago. It's called Blood, Bones, and Butter, The Inadvertent Education of a Reluctant Chef, by Gabrielle Hamilton. And she not only became a chef, so it's a memoir of her life, but how she became a chef. And also she went and got an MFA, I think at Michigan. So she's a writer and she's a chef, and she opened this like very successful boutique restaurant, which I think might have been a casualty of the pandemic, but this small restaurant in New York City called Prune. So anyway, I really loved that memoir. And I don't know why we were reading a lot of food memoirs this summer, but my husband's a food economist here at Penn State in the College of Agriculture. And he went back and read Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential, which is a book that I want to read. I've taught a chapter of it before as an essay. And he was a great writer and just lively person too. And then a friend of mine had given me this book a long time ago by a woman named Molly O'Neill. It's a memoir. I can't remember the title of it, but it's about baseball, and her brothers were baseball players, but she became a chef and in New York City. And it's about baseball and food and making your way in the world in the highest echelons of these fields. And so anyway, for some reason, we've been reading a lot of like chef memoirs. But they're really about life and about, how you feed people and how you find your passion and all that stuff. So those are ones. Of course, Mary Karr is one of my favorite memoirists. I've read a lot of her books, and I'm teaching fiction writing for the first time. I mean, I'm a fiction writing class this fall at Penn State. And so I found occasion to return to a few of my favorite fiction writers, one of whom is Grace Paley. We just read a story of hers last week called Zagrowski Tells. When I was in my 20s, she was one of my favorite writers. So I've been returning to her. And Andre Dubus III is another writer I met at Fine Arts Work Center, and his memoir, Townie, is a great one too. I could go on and on, but those are some of the writers.
Thank you for that lovely list of writers and making time to hang out with me today. I've learned so much and I've had a wonderful time.
Thanks, Andy, for the opportunity. It's not every day I get to do this, so thank you. And good luck with this project. This is a great project.